So, who was Gregor Mendel? Gregor Mendel was born in 1822 in Heisendorf, Austria. At the age of 21, Mendel entered a monastery where he performed many scientific experiments in the monastery garden. So, as a priest or monk, he had to have some kind of a service at the monastery, and he decided, in his quiet time that he was going to perform these experiments. And he was actually one of the first ones that was really good about using the scientific method. Mendel discovered the principles of heredity, which is the passing of traits from parents to offspring, and we will be talking a lot about that passing of traits from parents to offspring. So Mendel used garden pea plants for his experiment. These peas have both male and female reproductive structures. So pollen from one flower can fertilize the ovule of the same flower. And when a purebred plant self-pollinates, all of the offspring will have the same trait as the parent. And you may be familiar with that from, pets like dogs. If it's a boxer, it came from a boxer that came from a boxer that came from a boxer. If it's passed that trait down for many generations, then it's considered purebred. Pea plants can also cross-pollinate, which means the pollen from one plant fertilizes the ovule of a flower on a different plant. Here we see an example of how it can self-pollinate, which means that the pollen on the anthers fall down into the ovule, and when that happens, it fertilizes the ovule. Or it could be the pollen from the anthers can blow on the wind or by an insect or a bird or some other kind of animal. It can get taken to a different flower and fall down into the ovule to fertilize. So Mendel studied only one pea characteristic at a time. So just like with any good science, you're only going to manipulate one variable at a time. So he was only studying one feature at a time. And these characteristics are really features that have different forms in a population. The different forms of a characteristic in genetics are called traits. So we'll use the term traits when we're talking about these different forms. So like seed shape is either round or wrinkled, tall or short, purple or white with the flower color. And Mendel was really careful to use plants that were purebred for each of the traits that he was studying. And by doing so, he would then know what to expect if his plants were to self-pollinate. So here we have a plant that produces wrinkled seed, crossing with one that produces round seeds. So if he's wanting them to cross-pollinate, what he did was remove the anthers from the one that he didn't want to have it self-fertilize, because he was going to be testing for what the results would be. So then he could take the pollen from the one and transfer it, and he would use a paintbrush to transfer it to the other one. Mendel crossed pea plants to study 7 different characteristics, and Mendel got similar results for each cross. One trait was always present in the first generation, which we refer to as the first filial, or we use a capital F with a subscript of 1, so first filial, and the other traits seemed to disappear. Mendel called the trait that appeared the dominant trait, and the trait that seemed to fade into the background was called the recessive trait. So the one that appeared is the dominant trait in this first generation. The one that faded into the background was called the recessive trait. Mendel's second experiment. So then what he did was he took that first generation and he allowed those plants to self-pollinate. So again, he crossed in the parent generation 2 purebreds. Then in the second set of experiments, he had that first generation self-pollinate. When they self-pollinated, what he found in that second generation is some of the plants were the recessive trait. The one that you did not see at all in that first generation now shows up in that second generation. So in the recessive trait did not show up as often as the dominant trait. So even though it's showed up now in the second generation, it's not showing up as often. So Mendel decided to figure out the ratio of dominant traits to recessive traits. And in all cases, the ratio was about 3-to-1 dominant to recessive. And you can see that in the chart here. If you were to analyze these and figure out the ratios, they are almost all a perfect 3-to-1 ratio. You really get that 3-to-1. And think about all the experiments that he did, all of the plants he was working with to get this information. So Mendel realized that his results could only be explained if each plant had 2 sets of instructions for each characteristic. Mendel's work really opened the door to modern genetics. Genetics is the study of heredity, that passing of traits from parents to offspring. Just instead of calling it just heredity, it's the study of heredity, which we refer to the whole thing as genetics. And Mendel is known as the father of genetics, or sometimes you might even hear the father of modern genetics. So, a great idea. Mendel knew that there must be 2 sets of instructions for each characteristic. And the instructions for an inherited trait are called genes. Originally, Mendel referred to them as factors, but now we refer to them as genes. The different forms, often dominant and recessive, of a gene are called alleles. So you get one allele from your mother, one allele from your father. An organism's appearance is known as its phenotype. Genes affect the phenotype. So phenotype, the way I can remember that the phenotype is the organism's appearance, phenotype starts with pH. Physical starts with pH. So the physical appearance, what you see when you look at something, is the phenotype. So for example, if you look at me, I have brown hair. So that's my phenotype. You would say Mrs. Monagle has brown hair because that's her phenotype. And then the combination of inherited alleles, the things you get from your mother and your father, together form an organism's genotype. Therefore, genotype is the genetic makeup or the alleles. Now, you can't look at a person and see a genotype. The genotype is what's on the genes. So I can remember phenotype, physical characteristics, genotype, what's on the genes. Homozygous, an organism has 2 identical alleles for a trait. We use capital letters for dominant traits. We use lowercase for recessive traits. So remember, you're getting one of these alleles from each parent. So, if both parents give you the dominant trait, then you would have 2 capital letters. If they both give you the recessive, you're going to get 2 lowercase letters. And we just use these letters to represent the alleles for the different genes. Heterozygous, an organism has 2 different alleles. So it might be you got a capital S from mom, a lowercase s from dad, or capital H from dad and a lowercase h from mom. And Mendel called these heterozygous plants hybrids. So that just means it's a cross of things. You probably heard of hybrids. Like we talk about hybrid corn because they've taken and they've crossed these different things that we want for the corn. What are the chances? So probability is the mathematical chance that something will happen. And the probability is most often written as a fraction or a percentage. Punnett squares are used to organize and show all the possible genotype combinations of offspring from particular parents. So if we look at this Punnett square, if we are to look at where we cross 2 parents like they did in the first generation and they're both purebred, we have lowercase p's saying they have that recessive trait. We have uppercase p's showing that dominant trait. And when we did the cross, we get all of the offspring are purple, which is a phenotype, and their genotypes are these big P, little p's. Now, Mendel also then had them self-pollinate. So when he had them self-pollinate, what he did was he took that offspring from the first generation, which would have alleles big P, big P, little p, and then he crossed them. And what we would then have is one that would have a big P, one that would be big P, another one that would be big P, little p. Now, this cross that you see written here, typically, like when I'm doing it, I will put the large P first, but because anytime you have that, the dominant trait is going to be the phenotype. It's what you're going to see, but we don't always have that. So I'm just telling you, if you put it this way, that's okay, but it's not my preference. So most of the time, we'll put the big P first. And then we have little p, where they get the recessive allele from both parents. In this case, it's a self-pollinating one, but that was the recessive allele that it could get from the parent.